Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Coming up on our show, we hear from Al Gore and the filmmakers behind his latest documentary on climate change. Plus the week's political developments, including today's announcement by Attorney General Jeff Sessions that he's tripling the number of investigations into leaks. Full analysis ahead. But first, a look at international affairs. The investigation into ties between Russia and President Trump's campaign continues to widen as special counsel Robert Mueller and a grand jury issue subpoenas. Meanwhile, tensions are mounting with Russia after President Trump signed a new package of sanctions by Congress. And North Korea's escalating missile tests are causing alarm, with Senator Dianne Feinstein calling it a clear and present danger. And joining me now is East Bay Congressman Eric Swalwell. He serves on the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman Swalwell, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me back.
So before we get to foreign affairs, I want to ask you, first of all, about today's news. Jeff Sessions increasing his investigations into leaked information. What are your thoughts on that? I'm
certainly concerned, about some of the leaks that are coming out, particularly that people on the president's team are concerned enough about, his policies and his governing that they are leaking out his conversations to world leaders. But I also don't agree with the president that leaks are the biggest national security issue facing us. He says the leaks. I happen to be mostly concerned about North Korea, Russians' interference in our elections, and combating ISIS across the world. But I think the president's focus on leaks is mostly an effort to distract away from more serious issues, and some that are closing in on him more personally, like the Russia investigation.
Let's talk about Russia, because we now know that special counsel Bob Mueller has impaneled a grand jury and they're issuing subpoenas. What does this tell you about the next phase of Mueller's investigation?
This is what progress in a criminal probe looks like, to go to the grand jury level. It allows you to reach deeper for documents and bring in witnesses you want to hear from. Now, on the House Intelligence Committee, we're not conducting a criminal probe. We want to answer the questions of how were we so vulnerable, whether any U.S. persons were involved, and what we can do to make sure this never happens again. So we want Bob Mueller to conduct his investigation unimpeded, without obstruction from the White House. Hopefully get back to us soon on that. But our responsibility really is to secure and protect the next election.
And what's the status of your investigation right now by the House Intelligence Committee?
I'm happy to say we've made more progress in the last few weeks than we were making the 5 months prior. We've brought in a number of witnesses, including percipient witnesses, people who were involved in the campaign. So that's important.
You brought in Jared Kushner.
Jared Kushner came before our committee, and he also released a statement the day before he testified. So now what we want to do is we want to test what Mr. Kushner told us and see if we can corroborate it or if it is repudiated by other evidence. But we just want to be able to report back to the American people as soon as possible about what happened and how do we make sure a mess like this never occurs.
What was your impression of Kushner? And do you believe everything he told you?
Yeah, I found him to be very smart, very worldly. He's a thoroughbred. His family was in the real estate business. He may not have had a political background, but he brought a business experience where he had, in his own statement, acknowledged a deep reach into the political, financial, and digital communication parts of the campaign. I'm going to withhold judgment on whether he was truthful or not. I want to test some of what he said.
Do you think he was a novice, the way that he said he was?
He was not a novice. And the campaign has tried to put out, we were in way over our head. All of this was happening very fast. I found him to be a very meticulous person.
Okay. And does Mueller's investigation and the latest information about the grand jury being impaneled, does that change the scope of your investigation at all?
No, we want to just follow the evidence wherever it takes us. Now, we know that there were deep personal, political, and financial ties that Donald Trump and his team and his family and businesses had with Russia. That's not disputed. What we want to really answer the question of is, did these contacts amount to just a coincidence because they occurred during Russia's interference campaign, or was it a convergence that they were working with Russia? Too early to tell right now, but I am comfortable that we're making progress.
And also on the subject of Russia, President Trump this week signed into law new sanctions against Russia that Congress passed with veto-proof majorities in both houses. But he was highly critical, even as he signed it. And Russian President Putin has already retaliated by making the U.S. cut its embassy staffs. What concerns you most now about our relations with Russia?
He signed it begrudgingly, but that's what democracy looks like. Sometimes Congress has to step forward as a co-equal branch of government and do what's best for the country, and we did that. But as far as the relationship with Russia, until we are able to speak eyeball to eyeball with Russia and say, we know that you did this, there's going to be a price to pay, and if you want to work with us and be a part of the table of international countries that are taken seriously. You can't do it again. It's going to be tough to work with them. They are disrupting Syria. They continue to move deeper into Ukraine, and also there are recent reports that they are arming the Taliban, who have killed U.S. soldiers. They're not our friend, and we just need a president that looks them in the eye and tells them that and expects more.
Meanwhile, the situation with North Korea is getting more tense. Just a week ago, North Korea launched a missile that flew for nearly an hour before crashing off the coast of Japan. And so we have a situation now where we fired our own missile from Vandenberg Air Force Base to test our own system. How worried are you about a North Korean missile being able to reach the U.S.? I mean, Senator Feinstein has called it a clear and present danger.
I'm very worried that American leadership is on the sidelines right now. And when you look through the history of America, when international challenges emerge, we are always leading the way to confront them. So I wish the president would look back at Yalta and Malta and Casablanca, opportunities where an American president brought together allies and non-allies and said, we are going to confront these challenges. Right now he's just tweeting at the Chinese and the South Koreans and the Japanese and complaining, when I think he could set that stage, have that conversation, and tell North Korea, we will not tolerate you having a nuclear weapon. But
ultimately, how much impact can we have? Because don't you think, doesn't China need to come into this equation? And without them, it seems the U.S. can't really do a whole lot on this issue with North Korea.
China is the primary source for food and fuel to North Korea. And if you're just antagonizing China, you're actually working against our interest of not being hit by a North Korean missile. So we have to work with China. But you don't just have to work directly with China. You can indirectly apply pressure through other allies you have who deal with China. But that requires, making friends and keeping the friends that you already have. And when you read these stories that the president is poking the Australians in the eyes or insulting our Mexican allies, you just wonder, how are we going to confront these challenges if our natural allies are wondering if we're still with them?
All right. Congressman Eric Swalwell, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Turning now to domestic policies. In addition to probing into leaks, Attorney General Jeff Sessions is reviewing the rules for when and how journalists can be subpoenaed. Earlier this week, President Trump threw his support behind a bill that would slash legal immigration to the U.S. in half. The new proposal prioritizes job skills over family ties. Critics contend it could hurt the labor pool for low-wage jobs done mainly by immigrants. Also, a Justice Department memo obtained by the New York Times suggests that the Trump administration may be looking to target affirmative action policies at college campuses. Joining me now are Carla Marinucci, senior writer at Politico, Melissa Murray, professor at UC Berkeley's Law School, and University of San Francisco political science professor James Taylor. Welcome to you all. So, Melissa, in addition to Jeff Sessions' announcement of several investigations into leaks, he's also been pretty aggressive about pushing the conservative agenda. Describe for us some of the things he's done in the last 6 months.
Well, President Trump may be skeptical about Jeff Sessions and his recusal, but Jeff Sessions has been prosecuting a very conservative agenda at DOJ since his appointment. And he has begun mandating that prosecutors enforce and prosecute to the maximum in terms of their charging decisions and the sentences that they seek. They have expanded the rules for police authority for issuing asset seizures, even for those who haven't yet been convicted of a crime or even been charged with a crime. And of course, they have mandated severe prosecution of immigration crimes, especially on the borders and in sanctuary cities.
So a lot of this really rolls back Obama-era policies, right? And actually 20 years worth of research into criminal justice reform.
Yeah, absolutely. And in California, I think there's a lot of concern when you talk about things like civil rights, police brutality issues. He has called these issues sort of anecdotal, without scientific fact. On sanctuary cities, as you mentioned, again this week, he threatened California sanctuary cities. On legal cannabis, which is an issue that potentially involves billions of dollars here in California, we still don't know where the Sessions Department of Justice is going to go. I mean, this is widespread. His agenda, as Melissa said, very conservative.
A lot of people would look at this, though, and say, that's great. People who support Trump and say he's carrying out the agenda he promised to carry out.
It's not a popular agenda. I think as much as he wants it to be perceived as such, his approval ratings are about 38%. His disapproval ratings are in the high 60s, the worst in modern presidential history. So he has no mandate. He has no political capital by which to mobilize. In fact, one of the phrases I see constantly with reference to Donald Trump, apart from popularity and the perceived power of the presidency, is presidential weakness. And I'm not talking about it in terms of whether he's a tough guy or not, but in terms of presidential history, whether Congress is stronger or the executive is stronger is an ongoing interplay over time, and it depends on how the individual in the office behaves as to whether or not Congress asserts itself more or less over time.
And speaking of behavior, it looks like he brought in Chief of Staff John Kelly to change the behavior of staffers and to really put in place some discipline. So Kelly has reportedly said he wants Sessions to stay as Attorney General. He's reining in staff members, but can he rein in the president?
That is the question. And I think, can he rein in the leaks is the other part of that question. The president, even this week, was there in West Virginia talking about a hoax in terms of this Russian investigation. Just as we have new developments there, the president has refused to stop tweeting. And meanwhile, those within the White House, it's very clear, are just leaking these transcripts this week, which was absolutely phenomenal and disastrous for the White House.
You're talking about the transcripts with the conversations with Mexico's president,
right? I mean,
Australia's
this has never before happened. So at this point, it is about whether Trump can discipline himself, and I think the record shows he can't, or isn't able to.
Kelly is the biggest babysitter in Washington right now. And he's there to impose discipline on a completely undisciplined White House and a completely undisciplined commander-in-chief.
Yeah.
So speaking of the transcripts, though, what do you think is the broader picture that has emerged from that? Because that he was talking to allies of the United States, Australia and Mexico. So what can we take away from that?
These calls were just mind-blowing. And the call with Mexico, for instance, I mean, you're talking like a telenovela. You have a president there with the president of Mexico basically saying, you know what I said during the campaign? Just forget all that. Let's just play act here. Let's make it a reality show and just tell them, you know,
you'll go along with it because otherwise I will look bad, is basically what Trump said.
The call to Australia was even more mind-blowing in the sense that here was a loyal ally. He knew nothing about the policy, and his only interest was, you're making me look bad. I think for a lot of reasons there's concern that these kind of calls are getting out, are going to make world leaders say, do I really need to talk to him on the phone? Yeah. But on the other hand, his lack of knowledge, it was just stunning, I think.
But again, I go back to the strong executive, strong legislature, you know, tug. And again, when you see a president articulating this kind of weakness, Congress asserts itself. Now, Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell have been unable to carry out the agenda that they fully want to carry out affirmatively, but they have done a lot of negative governing. And before we started, I talked about these whole presidential personality and styles categories, and the worst possible style a president could use is what's known as active negative, where the president is active, but his worldview is very negative in governing, going after affirmative action, going after transgender people, going after reminding gay people in this country this past week that they are not covered by law. Things of that sort, targeting specific minority groups, Muslims and others, is a part of this negative worldview.
But his core supporters would counter that he is doing what they elected him to do. And it would
still be him carrying out a negative worldview that they support. It's not that these people have a positive worldview about these things that I just outlined. They don't support affirmative action. They don't support legal or illegal immigration, and aren't inclined to any sort of.
But we've got to say the business numbers look pretty good, and he's taking credit for that.
But he shouldn't.
There's
the same blame is to Obama, right?
There's a lag time.
That's right, and I think on the other thing, his supporters are still with him, as you mentioned, Tweet, and that's where the Republican Party is going to look at those poll numbers. They are falling, but have not fallen enough yet to have a lot of people fall off the wagon with him.
And a lot of the things that he's been doing, I mean, I think you cannot discount the effect of Robert Mueller looking and investigating everything that's going on with this Russian investigation, and suddenly you have Trump just throwing out red meat to the base. Like, part of this is the politics of distraction and keeping the base occupied while there is a real threat to the legitimacy of this administration.
And I want to ask you some more about Mueller because, as we all know, he's now impaneled a grand jury. They've been issuing subpoenas. Explain to us the role of a grand jury, Melissa, how they work, And what are some of the tools that they would give Mueller that he would not have otherwise?
So the grand jury is an initial phase of a criminal investigation. When a prosecutor has enough information, enough evidence to make a charge, bring an indictment, they can present that indictment to the grand jury, which is a secret group of 23 people. The grand jury hears testimony. It's just the prosecutor. There's no defense attorney. And they can, depending on the way they view that evidence, if there's probable cause that a crime has been committed, they can issue a true bill and have that indictment go forward. And that begins the criminal prosecution. So the fact that he's impaneled a grand jury is a serious, serious matter. And I don't think it's a coincidence that you are having Trump making these speeches, tossing red meat to the base at a time when Robert Mueller is assembling a grand jury and issuing these subpoenas.
And can the president himself be subpoenaed to testify?
Probably. I mean, so there are a lot of questions about what the president can do. Can the president be prosecuted? Probably not. He probably would have to be impeached first because participating in a criminal prosecution might impede his ability to perform his duties of office. But he could certainly testify before Congress and probably before a grand jury. And all of these proceedings are secret, so it's unclear whether we'd ever know.
I think that the line in the sand moment here, I think what everybody's going to be watching is if he has to appear before the grand jury, as Clinton did and Nixon did, he has to tell the truth.
Yes.
We know he's had a little problems with that. There won't be an attorney there.
Right.
He won't know what other witnesses have said. And it's a felony to lie to the grand jury. Impeachment, as you said. So, I mean, there's a lot at stake here. There are a lot of dominoes that have to fall first. But that's why this is a moment that everyone is watching right now.
And let's talk also about the other headline of the week, which is the immigration policy, right? He came out and he backed a bill that was proposed by 2 Republican senators, but it was introduced back in February. It would severely reduce the number of legal immigrants who can come to this country. It would slash in half the number of refugees allowed. Why do you think he decided to throw his weight behind this bill now?
This is more dog whistling to the base. I mean, this is a bill that would cut in half the number of green cards that are issued, that would eliminate family-based immigration, which has been the hallmark of our immigration system for the last 100 years, as far as I know, and would instead focus in a way that Canada does, more on highly skilled and college-educated immigrants.
A merit-based system.
Speaking at that.
Yes, a completely merit-based system. And when he threw his support behind the Perdue Cotton bill, he talked about the fact that these low-wage immigrants were coming to the U.S. and taking jobs from hardworking Americans. That's fodder for the base. That's exactly about the base at a time when this administration is imperiled.
And does legal immigration, reduced legal immigration, mean more jobs for Americans?
It may for some groups, but overall, no. It's negligible. And there's no clear evidence that this would have a bump and a positive effect on average American workers. In certain areas, in certain industries, and in certain cities like, say, service industries in Washington, D.C., hotel services is where you find, say, African-American entry-level workers competing with Latinos in that, but that's not a problem here in California in general and in other places throughout the country. So this is not a one-size-fits-all problem, and there can't be a one-size-fits-all solution.
But this could really affect California because we're the largest state for immigrants, of course. But when you have a merit-based system where you give points for speaking English, for having good, and you can't bring your family with you, Silicon Valley's got to be worried. How do they recruit really top people when they can't bring the families here? That's why Canada and Mexico are already trying to recruit people, high-tech people from India, with that very thing in mind. So, I mean, it's a big issue for California when you're talking about changing the immigration system from the ground up.
It's not just Silicon Valley, it's also the Central Valley. I mean, we depend on low-wage workers for farming. So good luck getting this out of committee. Good luck getting 50 senators to sign on to this, because there are going to be Republican senators in places like Texas and Iowa and who are not going to be able to sign on to this bill in good conscience, given the strength of farming and agriculture in their
and I think historically in California, if you look back at the Bracero program, right, and then that ended in 1964 under President Johnson. That was the Mexican guest worker program to come and pick tomatoes. And once that ended, there weren't more jobs once the Mexican guest workers left. They put machines to work. All the tomatoes then started being picked by machines. So it doesn't necessarily mean an increase in jobs.
No, we've seen it even social media where there are these sort of empty fields of where workers used to be in Mississippi, where you had farm workers who are gone because of fears of immigration or ICE policies. And like you said, in certain industries, people know directly that this will have a deleterious effect on Americans in general.
Okay, well, much more to come, right? Every week there seems to be something.
Totally.
Yes.
Thank you all for being here.
you.
Carla Marinucci, Politico senior writer, James Tiller, political scientist at USF, and also Melissa Murray, UC Berkeley Law School professor. This week, the film An Inconvenient Sequel, Truth to Power, opens in theaters across the nation. 10 years after he won an Oscar for An Inconvenient Truth, the sequel follows Al Gore as he travels the world to champion clean energy. While he was in town last week, the former vice president gave his reaction to President Trump's decision to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accords.
Well, I was worried when he made that speech, but I was really heartened when immediately afterward the entire rest of the world redoubled its commitment to the Paris Agreement, as if to say, we'll show you, Mr. Trump. And then so many governors and mayors and business leaders here in the U.S. said, we're going to stay in the Paris Agreement and we're going to meet the U.S. commitments regardless of what President Trump does. And by the way, California's Governor Jerry Brown led the way and then followed up with the historic legislation here last week. So it looks now as if the U.S. is going to meet our commitments under Paris anyway.
We sat down with San Francisco-based filmmakers Bonnie Cohen and John Schenk to talk about the making of An Inconvenient Sequel. Monica Lamb has the interview.
Bonnie Cohen, John Schenk, thanks so much for being here.
Absolutely.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So why now, 10 years after the documentary An Inconvenient Truth, why is a sequel needed?
Really what happened now, 10 years later, is the potential for renewable energy, the sustainable energy revolution, as Al calls it, has really come to fruition in a big way.
We're seeing a tremendous amount of positive change.
The cost down curve of solar and wind, the down curve is as dramatic as the up curve in global warming that Al showed in the original movie. So there's a drama going on now between the policy that will move us faster towards those solutions and Mother Nature, which is screaming louder and louder, hey, the storms are more intense, the seas are rising, the ice is melting, it's actually worse than we thought it would be at this point. It's a real drama.
You show a lot of that in your documentary. Who do you think is going to win this race?
Do you mean between Mother Nature and the sustainability revolution? Well, hopefully mankind will get on top of this. I mean, the idea is that, Al Gore often talks about the drama of the sustainability revolution being as intense as the industrial revolution, but it's going to happen, hopefully, with the speed of the digital revolution. So with the cost down curves where they are, more and more countries can get on board and start to implement. The question is just how quickly can we do it? So it's actually a fairly hopeful film, all told. Like, we spend time with a Republican mayor in the heart of oil country in Texas who has decided to take his entire community 100% renewable.
Now, so I assume that the reason you did this is that the two of you are just rabid environmentalists.
Well, not exactly, because you're in Georgetown,
right,
which is the reddest city in the reddest county in Texas, and I'm a conservative Republican. Okay. But, our duty to our ratepayers is to provide them with the lowest possible utility cost.
And money talks.
But then doesn't it just make sense from a common sense standpoint? The less stuff you put in the air, the better it is.
So there are some wonderful examples in the film of ways that we're turning the ship around.
And yet there are still so many people who remain to be convinced that climate change poses real dangers, or let alone that it even exists. Why do you think it's been such a hard sell?
Well, going back to the 80s, the fossil fuel industry really felt threatened by the science, the truth of the matter, and they just took a page out of the tobacco industry's playbook and literally hired the same companies to sow these seeds of doubt about the reality of climate change, unfortunately, because in the meantime, our planet is really suffering.
Hurricane Sandy slammed into New York City last night, flooding the World Trade Center site.
But as Mother Nature screams louder and louder, in the last 7 years, I believe, we've had 11 once-in-a-thousand-year storms in this country. The sea level is rising to the point where at high tide now, there's water in the streets of Miami where we followed Al in this film. Regular, everyday Americans are seeing climate change firsthand, so it's harder and harder to deny that it's happening. And on the other hand, jobs in solar and wind are taking shape much faster than other industries. It's several times the rate of job creation in other industries. So it's harder and harder for people who are on the denial side to keep denying what is happening, both with the hopeful sustainable energy revolution and the fact that the climate crisis has really gotten worse.
You liken a lot of the work of Al Gore and the fight against climate change to a social movement. And in this case, is there a bad guy? Is there an oppressor that you're fighting against?
Well, unfortunately, this issue has become a partisan issue.
It's a promise to cancel billions in climate change spending.
Much like with the tobacco industry, fossil fuel companies have done a very convincing number on a lot of our population and sort of forced it into the political realm where now ordinary people are falling down on party lines when it comes to the environment, and we have to recapture that back and take it out of that realm.
India is one of the world's largest consumers of coal, and to make the film you went to India. How do people in India view climate change?
It's very complicated. There's a sense in a lot of developing countries that they are in the middle of their industrial revolution, and the burning of coal is creating jobs, it's creating an economy there that they are entitled to. It happens to be happening 150 years after those of us in the developed world have already done that work and created damage to the environment. So there's a kind of a push-pull conflict with the developed and developing world about who's now responsible. And the Indians, rightly so, I feel, think that it's their turn and they should be allowed to burn coal. But of course, the argument needs to be made that if you can't breathe, it's a little difficult for citizens to live in the country. So it's complicated, and that's why there's a scene in the film where Al Gore is meeting with the environmental minister in India, and they actually talk out this exact conflict that I'm describing, and Al Gore tries to kind of bring them around and make them realize that yes, you are deserving of this. Let's figure out a way to bring you on board and do something for the environment at the same time.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for your work and for documenting the work of Al Gore.
Thank you for having us.
Appreciate it.
And that will do it for us. You can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Thank you for joining us.